Test. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to another Center for Faith Studies event at Countryside Community Church, with a virtual welcome to all of those who are watching us streaming live via Darkwood Brew and the internet. Our special guest, Frank Schaeffer, is here with Eric Elnes, Senior Minister at Countryside Community Church and host of Darkwood Brew broadcast on Sunday evenings. Please welcome both of them. And I hope you've had time to read about them in the program because it's really quite astonishing, their achievements and successes. Frank, as you may know, presented one of our Center for Faith Studies lectures last year, and it was so well received and compelling that we were anxious to bring him back again. He and Eric have become good friends, and in fact, many of us here at Countryside count Frank as a new friend as well. It was a pleasure to have him here this week. In the way of housekeeping details, our restrooms are to your left as you exit the sanctuary, and Eric and Frank's books are to the right, and the cookies and coffee are straight ahead. So you can file that all away for later, for information for later. Please silence your cell phones now as a courtesy to everybody else in the room. When we consider this new topic in Christianity, that of convergence, I think we all will find it extremely helpful to hear from both Eric and Frank in a dialogue and in a question and answer format. With that in mind, you might consider in advance a question that you would have for either of them. When the time comes for Q&A, you can raise your hand and an usher will bring you a microphone. We do ask that you do use the microphone so that everyone can hear you. After the Q&A, please let Eric and Frank exit the sanctuary first so that they can be there to greet you in the foyer. Framing tonight's presentation as a dialogue fits very well with what I have observed about Eric and Frank. While their life journeys and professional experiences have been different, when I am around them, I see much that these two have in common. They are both excellent listeners and storytellers. They are articulate, brilliant, critical thinkers, patient, and deeply spiritual. They enjoy each other and care very much about Christianity and our world. Please help me welcome both Frank Schaeffer and Eric Elnes to the chancel.
Thanks for coming tonight. Frank and I thought it would be wonderful to start out our conversation together, frame our thinking with a poem by a poet we respect highly named David White, who graciously gave us permission to read the poem this evening. The poem is called Where Many Rivers Meet. It goes like this. All the water below me came from above. All the water below me came from above. All the clouds living in the mountains gave it to the rivers, who gave it to the sea, which was there dying. And so I float on a cloud become water, central sea surrounded by white mountains, the water salt once fresh, cloud fall and stream rush, tree roots and tide bank leading to the river's mouths, and the mouths of the rivers sing into the sea. The stories buried in the mountains gave out into the sea, and the sea remembers and sings back from the depths where nothing is forgotten. The stories buried in the mountains give out into the sea, and the sea remembers and sings back from the depths where nothing is forgotten. We're going to frame our conversation around three lines of that last stanza, where stories were buried in the mountains, and then the next, give out into the sea, and finally, the sea remembers. And I'm going to stand. I got too much energy when I talk like this. So. But I have to confess that 3 years ago, I was invited to speak at the Wild Goose Festival in Shakori Hills, North Carolina, which was a gathering of Christians from around the country and, in fact, the world, largely who have kind of left the evangelical tradition and are looking for a new thing, or from the more mainline progressive churches. And when I was just perusing the list of other presenters, I saw the name Frank Schaeffer on the bill, and it shocked me enough that I was ready to pull out of the festival. Literally, pull out of the festival. About 25 years ago, if you would have asked me of all the people that represented the worst in Christianity, and really that I counted as my enemy, it would have been Frank Schaeffer. In fact, it was Frank Schaeffer. So I called my friend Diana Butler Bass and said, "Is this festival what I thought it was? I see Frank Schaeffer's name is on the bill." And she said, "You haven't been keeping track of Frank lately, have you?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, Frank has changed. Frank has changed." Well, if it was only Frank who had changed, we still wouldn't be sitting here as friends before you. We're here because Frank has indeed changed, and so have I. We've each been like raging rivers on opposite sides of the mountain of Christian faith in America, Frank on the right and me on the left, and have raged with those rivers for many years. But each of us have found, in a sense, those rivers have run their course. And in order to continue in the Christian faith in a way that is recognizably Christian, we had to experience, both of us, a form of dying and a rebirth into that ocean that awaits. And in both our dying to our old traditions, what we discovered, much to either one of our surprises, was that in that sea in which we woke up in, we were floating right next to each other and have been floating there since. My story begins on July 3rd, 1970. I was 6 years old, and my father had invited me to come with him down to near his office in Seattle, where I grew up next to Seattle, and make our way down, have lunch, and then go to the Pike Place Market. And if you've ever been to the Pike Place Markets, it's a wonderful place with fishmongers and arts and crafts and so forth. And around the 4th of July, they really have a lot of activities. And so we made our way, we're walking towards the square, and as we approached the square, I noticed there was a man on my left, with a table set up, and he had a megaphone, and there was a banner across the table that read, I was 6 years old, this is Socialist Party. I have no idea what socialist meant, but party I got. He's inviting people to a party. Except he seemed really kind of angry. And I wonder, well, no wonder nobody seems to be coming to his table. He seems angry as he's inviting people. And so I'm just kind of wondering about this man when I noticed another gentleman. He was rather short and rotund, and he had an American flag in one hand and a shopping bag in another, and there was steam coming out his ears. He marched across the square straight towards this man at the table, obviously not happy with the party that he's trying to be invited to. He starts yelling at this man, and then the man's response, I was a little shocked, but he just got angrier in his megaphone, shouting, and finally the man pushed him aside, tore off the banner of the table, which made the party guy shout even louder in his megaphone, which then prompted the flag guy to upend the table completely, and then he started after him, ready to punch him. Well, at that point, my father, and we were not very many feet away at this point, my father rushed in and put his body between the flag man and the party man, and held out his hand and said, "Stop. He has every bit as much right to be here as you do." Well, this just made the flag man completely berserk, and he began to take swings at my father. Now, from my perspective, remember I'm 6 years old. my world is like Batman and Robin and Spider-Man. And in my world, whenever I see adults fight, it's to the death. In my world, what I saw before me was my father and this man about to fight to the death. And I went hysterical. But through my tears, I could see the man trying to swing at my father, but my father, he's 6'5". And he has arms long enough. All he had to do was hold out his arm like this, and the man kept trying to swing. He couldn't do it. So finally, he just huffs and stomps off. Well, my father then comes over to me, and I'm completely melted down. And he takes my hand, and we walk to a restaurant, and he buys me a Coke, and I'm just kind of deep breaths, deep breaths. And, I'm asking, what happened, Dad? And he takes out a napkin, and he draws a circle on that napkin and labels it socialist. And he draws another circle, labels it Democrat, and then draws a line down the middle of the napkin, and then makes another circle Republican, and begins my first ever political lesson in my life. And the way he's describing these three parties, it's very evident to me that my father and the socialists are about as far as politically apart as you could get. In fact, probably my father was more in alignment with the guy with the flag. I thought, and yet, through the eyes of my 6-year-old consciousness, what my father had just done was risked his life in order that someone who he disagreed with could have the right to speak and be heard. And that was really probably my first real taste of Christianity, to what it meant to be Christian and what it meant even to be Jesus, that self-giving on behalf of others. Fast forward, it's 1985, I'm a junior in college, I'm on my way to study in Nantes, France. A friend of mine, though, had spent some time at a little Christian living community called L'Abri in Weymouth, Switzerland, in the mountains. And he'd had a wonderful time there, and I was really rather intrigued by Christian communities. And at that point, I was really struggling with this vocation called ministry. Should I become a minister or not? I'd been really turned on by this not only idea, but an experience of a God who loves us beyond our wildest imagination, and who loves all of us this way, and is connected personally to us as well as communally. And so I decided to go to L'Abri on my way to Nantes. I spent a week there. L'Abri was the living community that Frank's father, Francis, started. And at L'Abri, I discovered that my understanding of Christian faith could not be more different than the Christianity that was represented there. I found many late-night arguments over literal interpretation of Scripture, over heaven and hell. And there were a couple of us in particular who were labeled as the questioners and got extra special attention. And I left L'Abri feeling like I just had my theological rear end kicked for about a week and wondering, am I crazy? This faith that I thought I would devote my whole life to, am I crazy? Or am I the only one, or my little community, the only community that believes these things? In my world, Frank then, he was on my radar from then on because his father had passed away the year before I got there, and Frank took over the movement. And from what I could tell, and of course I didn't know Frank personally, all I got was what any of us get, little sound bites and so forth, and filled into my own prejudices, amplified there. What Frank became for me was that rotund man with the flag and the bag, someone who I would oppose with everything I had to put my life between his form of faith and forms even that were different from my own that needed to be protected. That's my story, buried deep in the mountains.
Well, my turn. You saw the graphic up here at the beginning. There were 2 pigs flying, and I just want you to know I'm neither of those pigs. Nor am I rotund.
I'm more of that.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, it's an interesting coincidence because Eric, of course, was picking up bits and pieces of what I became as my father's sidekick for a while in the 70s and the early 80s. Soon after my dad's death, I was on my way out of the movement that he had tagged me with for the next 25 years. You really ought to read the newspaper once in a while. I mean, what's the use of going on Rachel Maddow regularly if you're tagged as a fundamentalist? You know, it's like... But anyway, it's an interesting point because my own journey out of the community in which I was raised really was because my parents were two different people. One set of Francis and Anita Schaeffer were very much like Eric Elnes. They were compassionate, they reached out to people, met them where they were, took care of their needs. They were much better people than the logic of their theology would have you believe if you just got into an argument about the Bible with them. So one of the things that Eric was exposed to in the community was that kind of fist-in-your-face, argumentative approach to the Bible. As Eric puts it sometimes, that, you know, the paper pope for evangelicals is this book that they regard as infallible and inerrant, not having an actual pope. But had Eric come in other circumstances to L'Abri at other points in the 60s, for instance, when I was a teenager, what he would have on another day thought he had stumbled into was a kind of a hippie commune that received all comers, drug addicts, young girls who were pregnant, African students who were being educated in Europe, who would stumble in and spend a few weeks or months. In another set of conversations, he would have said, wow, there are gay people here who are being received and taken care of, even though the official theology would have been anti-gay. And yet there was an overriding compassion there that kind of trumped that. So as the years went by, one of the reasons I got out of the movement, actually, the evangelical movement and the right wing and the religious right, which my father helped start with a little nudge from me making the documentary series that really began the evangelical pro-life movement and a number of other projects, was that when I moved to the States in 1980 and began to travel here and live here, even though I was an American citizen, I had lived abroad in this mission, I found that the picture, the ideological picture that had been painted of people like you was inaccurate. Because in fact, even back then, the sort of people I got on with, just on an aesthetic and human level of contact, were more like Eric than they were like me. Does that make any sense? So what I believed officially, and the kind of human beings that interested me, people who read books, people who liked the films I liked, were interested in the music I was interested in, who were open and receptive to other people and other points of view, were more what Eric represents as he stands here this evening than what I represented. But, you know, as I've mentioned other times and maybe here before, but it's worth repeating, you know, there's only two communities that function in a nepotistic way that I was raised in. One is North Korea, where if you are Kim Jong-il something, third or fourth, you get to be in charge. And the other is the evangelical community, where if you look at the big worldwide ministries, they're either being run by the sons of, or the daughters of, or the families of, or at least half the families on the payroll. These are kind of family corporations. And ours was no different. So it was actually a very natural phenomena for me to be both tagged by people who didn't like what L'Abri was standing for as sort of this successor, and also follow in that wake for a while. I got out for a number of reasons, and if you're interested, there's a couple of books I have here tonight, Crazy for God and Patience with God and Sex, Mom, and God, which, by the way, my publisher said would have sold more if I'd said Sex with Mom and God. But even I draw a line at certain points. But in any case, that journey is spelled out there and in a couple of the novels I've written and so forth. But really, to cut to the heart of it, it's that the compassion that this Christian ministry, as Eric knows a lot of evangelical ministries have a great deal of compassion at their core. Outweighed in my mind as I grew up and lived apart from this ministry and decided that on an aesthetic and rational basis I could no longer be an evangelical Christian as I had been raised to be. But nevertheless, I took that interest in other human beings and the compassion that I saw my parents live by, and that's the path that I was interested in continuing to follow. And so for me, I just simply reversed the picture. I put the behavior first and the content of character first ahead of official belief. And to this day, I think that's the way I see the world. That's why the position I write from, that's who I try to be to my 4 grandchildren and 3 children. And that is that the content of your character and your actual relationship with people should define your ideas about those people rather than your ideas defining them or who you are. I think who you are is much more important than what you say you are or what you say you believe. And I think you've probably all found that to be true. So as we talk here tonight, and in the Q&A session, we can go into more of my journey if you're interested. But I think in terms of today and what we're talking about, the thing that is most interesting to me is not so much where I came from, but where Eric and I sitting here tonight would like to go to together, both as individuals who are friends, but also representing a movement that is being shattered from within, an evangelical community coming apart at the seams as young people are leaving, a world in which religion has a deservedly bad name, whether it's suicide belts or anti-gay initiatives or whatever it may be, and a country where you have a lot of people who say they are spiritual but not religious, who yet, as Eric and I were talking about today, it seems to me, are longing for an excuse to go home again, if you can put it that way. Home being the church of some form or another, or some form of liturgical worship, whatever it might be, or community. But they're not given that excuse because every time they tap back into the environment which they have left, often for good reason, they just find more of the same. The bottom line of big business in the evangelical world particularly, the lack of compassion, or, if I may say so, to throw a little bit of a challenge out here tonight so it's not all just tickling our ears, the lack of Christology and theology in the progressive and the liberal movement, which has been very good at deconstructing the biblical myths, not very good at putting anything back in its place, which holds people's attention. So I'll finish with that, and maybe that would be an interesting direction for us to talk about a little bit.
Amen. Yeah. Giving out into the sea. That's we could actually start with that point. In 2004, I came back to the church I was serving in Scottsdale, Arizona, from a 3-month sabbatical, and found my church in utter turmoil. It wasn't in turmoil because I had been gone. We had great leadership while I was gone, but it was in turmoil because, well, think about 2004, where America was religiously and politically. There was quite a lot of talk about where religion was taking America in a presidential election year. And I had a high school choir director came up to me in exasperation, and she said, Eric, I'm just tired of being a Christian butt. I'm like, what do you mean by that? And I thought she meant B-U-T-T. And but she said, no, you don't get it. I'm really excited about my faith, and I love this church and so forth. And I talk about it, when I'm out meeting people and so forth, just because I like to talk about it. But I found that whenever the C word comes out, i.e. Christian, I might as well be radioactive. I feel like I have to say, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't hate gays. I'm a Christian, but I love people of other faiths and don't condemn them. I'm a Christian, but I don't read the Bible literally. I'm a Christian, but I believe in the separation of church and state. All these buts. And I just want to be, I'd love it to see a day when, if it came out that I'm a Christian, the image in people's minds at least would have some semblance of correspondence to who I am, whether they affirm me or not. And it was frustrating. That comment really got under my skin because, as Frank has just kind of suggested, my own faith tradition in the liberal progressive side had really done a severe disservice in America when we basically gave fundamentalism the Christianity. We basically handed over Christianity to them because we basically concluded that whatever the fundamentalists do badly, in our view, of course, we won't do it all. They do the Bible badly, well, we won't do the Bible. They do Jesus badly, well, we don't do much Jesus then. We'll kind of hedge on that. And they do prayer badly, well, we won't do prayer. And evangelism, well, we don't even mention the E word in a mainline church. And consequently, we have not had much public witness. We've basically given the reins to those people who we think are representing it, in our view, poorly. Anyway, to make a long story short, many people who go to Countryside know the story. I'm going to shorten it even more, but that launched a walk across the country with a few folks to try to raise a voice for a more progressive vision of Christianity. We were really walking to say that you can be a lover of Jesus and love gays. You can be a lover, or be one. You can be a lover of Jesus and love people of other faiths. You can be a lover of Jesus and love the Scriptures, but not read them literally. And you can affirm the separation of church and state, and affirm that faith and science can go together in the pursuit of truth, not simply be combatants. You can be a lover of Jesus and not think that everybody who doesn't believe like you is going to burn in hellfire for eternity, as if God was going to be suddenly become Satan, after you die for some certain people. We're going to walk for that, and we weren't going to go out bashing the fundamentalists, but all of us who walked really did have this understanding that basically if America could just be free of these folks, it would just be a better place. But almost from the very beginning, God seems to have had other plans for us. And really, in the very first week of the walk, we discovered the first sign that our view, as much as it raged within us, may not be the defining view of the larger picture. And I write about this quite a bit in my book, Asphalt Jesus, and it's also the story of our first kind of encounter this way appears in the film The Asphalt Gospel. But I want to I'll just focus on one story from that period that isn't in either the book or the film. So the first week of the walk, we were in this area in northeastern Arizona that it was so conservative that no churches wanted to host us. And we were staying in a Presbyterian camp, and the manager of the camp was not a Presbyterian, but went to one of these conservative churches. And I really wanted to meet up with Christians. We didn't have a speaking engagement because nobody wanted anything to do with us. So I thought, I want to go to the most conservative church I can find in the area and just simply sit there and experience this, because we're going to be meeting up with all kinds of people like this, and I need to, it's been a long time since I worshiped in a fundamentalist church, and so I asked how many people want to go along with me, and only one person consented. They were all afraid, like, all hell's going to break loose if you go there. And that's the story. The story about going to that church is what I write about, and what appears in the film was the story of going to Jesus First Baptist Church. But what happened to the other walkers is perhaps even more interesting, in the sense that they decided to go to a church that wasn't the most conservative church in the area. And what they stumbled into was a church that was even more conservative than the church that we landed in. It was so conservative, the minister was literally telling people that you have no business trying to improve anybody's life. No business whatsoever. The only business you have is saving souls. So every second you put into trying to help somebody with their emotional problems or help with poverty or anything like that is a second wasted, because we need to get people in this life raft before they die. Literally, that was the sermon. They came back in an utter state of shock. Now, during this time at this camp, we are early on in the walk, and we are going through all kinds of things about what's our message, especially if the press is asking us, and how do we confront the evils of fundamentalism and all this stuff. But we were also kind of aware of the fact that the woman who was the manager of the camp, she was in the kitchen the whole time as we were going through hours of this kind of in the cafeteria all by ourselves, kind of talking about these things. And it was very probably absorbing all this. Well, we discovered that she was a member of that ultra fundamentalist church. And interesting enough, the church that I'd gone to, we'd had this amazingly transformative experience that had shown us that you can have community with people who believe very differently. If you will just get your ego out of the way enough, Jesus might actually show up and confound you all. Well, just as we were leaving this camp, the director pulled myself and the co-leader aside, Rebecca Glenn. And she pulled us aside into the kitchen, and she said, I just want to tell you before you leave, I've been hearing what you've been talking about, and we're kind of bracing, yes. And she goes, I just want to tell you, you're walking for me. And we said, walking for you? And she said, yes, you're walking for me. I've been hearing what you're talking about, and there's a lot of us who hold a very similar faith. In fact, she said that her son, 2 years ago, had come out as being gay, and it erupted in her family, that fact. And at first they sent her to the minister of their church to straighten him out. Didn't work, and eventually he had to leave the community because there was no place, there were no friends, there was no job he could have, there was no social network, nothing. He had to leave the community, and in fact, her husband had disowned him. She said, I've known him since he was born. He was like this since he was born. I know that if he was like this since he was born, that God made him that way, and if God made him that way, it must be good. And she said, people like me, we can't speak up in our communities. We live in small towns, and yeah, everything gets destroyed if we stick out. She said, maybe one of these days, if enough of you will speak out, maybe it will embolden us, and we can finally say, amen to that. That experience was replicated over and over and over 2,600 miles of walking across the country, meeting up with people we thought were miles and miles away from us, who underneath the surface actually shared the very same or very similar hopes and dreams, passions, and desires for a future of Christian faith that we had. We could no longer write off people who were raging in the river on the opposite side of the Christian mountain.
Yeah, I think that's a good story, and Erica told me that before, and I've done a lot of thinking about it because I've had a similar series of experiences, really meeting up with people on all sides of many issues. And I think, just a little political note, since I do political blogging for the Huffington Post, people often ask me, especially Europeans and so forth, well, if people are so right-wing and the majority of voters are still white Americans, how did Barack Obama get elected twice? And I think that is a good reality check once in a while, because yes, indeed, Congress has been obstructionist, but I think there are a lot of folks like that woman that Eric was talking to out there, who in the quiet of the voting booth aren't exactly the tick all the boxes right-wing majority that we tend to think is out there. So maybe that's a caution to be a little less paranoid about our neighbors we don't get on with, because who they really are sometimes is very different than our caricature of them. I would like to go back to the point we were making together earlier and just take off from that. I think that as you look at this issue that we're here talking about tonight on what's changing in the church, in Christianity, in our religion in this country, I think that there's going to be a great reckoning coming, and I don't mean a judgment, but a kind of a recalibration. I think that there are many people in the evangelical community who have changed. I know this because of an unscientific survey, because of my book, Crazy for God, here. And this is, of course, a little pitch for the book, but I actually have a reason for doing this. Besides selling the few copies that are on the table there. When I left the evangelical community, I kind of slammed the door. I wrote a series of 3 novels, starting with Portofino, and I had the good fortune with my works of fiction to get good reviews, and the novels were translated into about 9 languages, and they're used around the world, sometimes as even textbooks in classes on coming-of-age stories. But I set the novel Portofino and then Saving Grandma and Zermatt in an evangelical community similar to the one I was raised in. And actually, if you read these novels, like Portofino, Zermatt, and Saving Grandma, you'll find that from the point of view of someone who isn't a cult follower of my parents, who would confuse the people in the book with my parents and think that the book was disrespectful to them because it wasn't a hagiography of them, from a normal point of view, they were very mild critiques of fundamentalism told from the point of view of a little boy. But the result was that I got a firestorm back in the early 1990s of furious letters from some of my parents' followers who had read the book, done what Eric did, saw my name on it, and thought they did the flip thing. They thought, aha, the next message from the Schaeffers. And it turned out, that this was a message from the other side, because I was now writing with a little bit of irony about the fundamentalist experience of growing up in a family where my mother would use prayer, for instance, in restaurants in places like Portofino, Italy, not to say grace over the meal, but to pray at the lost, who was everybody but our family, who were gathered around. And I envied the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans who came on vacations because they just made their sign of the cross or didn't have to pray at all and could just eat their food, where my pastini and brodo would just get cold and the olive oil would run out of the olives and get on to the mortadella, and it was like, why do we have to do this? And the little English girl sitting across from me, who I had a crush on by the time I was 11 or 12, would always look at me and go like this. So I grew up wondering why we had been called to be weird. And that's what the book's about. They're quite funny. But I got furious letters off them, so I didn't exactly rush into writing memoirs. I waited till I was in my early 50s before I did Crazy for God, and I told my wife, Jeannie, I said, well, I've always gotten these letters saying how much are real and so forth, and I'd written 3 books on my experience of being a parent of a Marine, Keeping Faith, A Father-Son Story of Love in the United States Marine Corps, which I'd been interviewed by Oprah and been on a whole bunch of things, so it became a New York Times bestseller, et cetera. So I had had a long journey out of evangelicalism and done a lot of other stuff. And then I figured, okay, I've got a lot of books out there. I'm going to come back and write for Crazy for God. But the you-know-what is going to hit the fan, and I'm going to get nothing but angry, cranky letters from evangelicals who happen to read this thing. The opposite happened. Email was just starting, so, that information highway was beginning. And with some trepidation, I started opening emails, about your book. And I found that a lot of people were saying, you've told our story, that Crazy for God and the subsequent books, Patience with God and Sex Mom and God, don't just represent my journey out of the evangelical movement. They represent that lady who might not stand up in her church, but just as she came to you and said, you're walking for me in your walk across America, they're emailing me saying, I can't leave my church because, maybe it's a paycheck they need, or maybe they just, are scared of their community, or maybe they have left, but you've told our story. So anecdotally, I have hundreds and hundreds of emails from people who, back in the day, would have been my parents' followers or much further to the right. People who were studying with Jerry Falwell, for instance, who have read these books, and I get some nasty stuff too once in a while, but I have been surprised, like Rip Van Winkle waking up, coming back, finding out 20 years after I've been out of the loop on this thing and sort of forgotten who all the key people are, or new ones have come in and replaced those that I knew, that actually things have changed. So I would just say, I would sum up this little piece by saying that there has been a sea change in evangelicalism, which opens the door to hearing what Eric is saying, and people like Eric or me. That's one point. But I'd say on the other hand, you have in the mainline denominations, if I'm reading the facts correctly, and some of my friends who are pastors are telling me the truth, there's also been a drop-off. And there's this kind of desperate sense of, what are we doing wrong? And I would come back to the fact that from the evangelicals who have journeyed out, there's this hunger to go home in a way, but they don't know where home is anymore. And the more mainline communities, the more progressive communities, have an opportunity as long as they can get over what you were saying, which is this sort of knee-jerk reaction that if evangelicals do prayer, then we don't. If they do evangelism, we don't. If they do Jesus, we don't talk about it. If they do Bible, we want to just deconstruct the mythology and say, that's not us anymore. We're into social work and psychology. It's not a question of meeting in the middle. It's a question of coming up with something different. And with that, I'd like to see what you have to say about that something different, because we've been talking about it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, by the time I got across the country with Crosswalk America, I could no longer think in the categories of liberal and moderate and conservative. We would see so much nuance in all those categories that those categories were basically erased for all practical purposes. What I really found were there were 3 basic energies operating underneath the surface of Christianity in the country. And the energies, all of us have all 3 in us, but we tend to emphasize one more than the other. And they transcend liberal, moderate, and conservative lines. And actually, you could speak of them theologically in terms of Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. energies. And we know the Good Friday energy. That's the energy like, who took away my Jesus? And by God, I'm going to crucify them. Whoever did it, once I find them, they're really going to have hell to pay. And of course, we found plenty of that in the conservative side of Christianity. We need to take back America and all this. But we also found that very fully present in the liberal end of Christianity as well. We need to take back Christianity from those bastards, and really make them pay. In fact, we were even found that we couldn't go to some churches who were in the liberal mainline church because we weren't out to bash the other side. They felt we were being too nice. And they were really disappointed that we weren't out there to lead the flag for the next, kind of bloody revolution. And so that anger is very much present on both sides. It transcends sides. But then there's another energy which we found plenty of, perhaps the majority of, which you could call the Holy Saturday energy. And you think, well, what's Holy Saturday energy? Well, where were the disciples on Holy Saturday? They weren't exactly in the streets saying, oh, it's great to know Jesus. They were hunkered down behind locked doors, afraid to go out, and wondering, what has happened to my Jesus? And wondering, is this whole thing, is the jig up? I mean, were we duped from the beginning, or is there any future at all? And really, the energy is angst, not anger. Then it's just angst, this anxiety about where is this all going, and I feel completely lost. And I don't know if there's a future. I don't even know what the future of my own faith is, let alone the Christian faith. And we found lots of that feeling from whether it be the woman who spoke to us in that Presbyterian camp, or plenty of people in the mainline church who just aren't out there sharing their faith because they're just saying, I don't know where it's at. But then we also ran into regularly, on both sides of the theological divide, people for whom it seemed as if they'd gone through Holy Saturday, that angst and that anxiety, and they had somehow in the darkness discovered that there was something moving in the dark. And it felt like it was for them, it was like the earliest hours of Easter Sunday. They were just kind of out in the twilight, seeing experiencing this stone that had been rolled away, and wondering, what on earth? We don't know exactly what's happening, but the stone has been rolled away, and we're excited, and we can't quite put our finger on why we're excited, even. But we ran into so many people who said, for some reason, I'm more excited about my faith now than I had been in many years. And it just felt like they were at the twilight hours of something, and they felt it, like we're really on the brink of something huge here, something new and exciting. Well, ever since that walk, I paid very careful attention to that Easter energy. What characterizes it? And when people can express it, what does it sound like? What categories does it inhabit? Spent years looking at this actually, and this is where what's interesting is that it comes from both sides of the theological divide. That experience of something very hope-filled, and it's like two rivers had flooded into the sea. They've died to themselves, and each river has brought kind of minerals down from the mountain that are distinct to their rivers. And in the sea, those minerals have been mixed up together and produced a whole other way of being. Saltwater and saltwater life rather than the freshwater life in a sense. And the sea actually wouldn't be the sea if it weren't for both rivers, not simply one river. And I can put some words behind that. Would love to have more discussion on this afterwards. What does this specifically look like? But a few months ago, I wrote down 12 kind of characteristics of what I would call convergence Christianity, that it's like this gift sharing that has been happening out in the ocean, producing new life. And I ran it by Frank, and I ran it by Diana Butler-Bass and Phyllis Tickle and Brian McLaren, and said, are you seeing it? Is this like, am I crazy? And they all came back saying, no, this is what we're seeing too at the grassroots. This is what I would call, and some of us are beginning to call, convergence Christianity looks like, where nothing has been forgotten from either tradition. First of all, they're letting go of the notion, these folks, that their particular faith is the only legitimate one on the planet, and they're embracing and understanding that God is greater than our imagination can comprehend or fence in. And thus they're open to the possibility that God may speak within and across all faith traditions. They are also, the second characteristic, they're letting go of literal and inerrant interpretations of their sacred texts while celebrating the unique treasures that their texts contain. They're embracing a more ancient, prayerful, non-literal approach to these same texts and finding new insights and resources as they do. I want to just provide one more layer of depth to that comment, concretization. I'm not going to do that for every one, just this one, just as an example of what this looks like if you just truly open this up. One of the gifts that the conservative side of the tradition brings with it into this ocean is this notion that the story of our faith is still really, really important. These stories we learn in the Bible still have relevance in our day. And they've left their stream because part of that story is not working for them anymore, because what they've done, their tradition has factualized these stories. It said, if you don't believe that these happen as an historical fact in every single instance, in every single dot and tittle of the Bible, then your salvation may be at risk. Take the Passover story, for instance, in Egypt, or the parting of the Red Sea. If you don't believe that happened, that God killed all the firstborn males in Egypt, or you don't believe that God parted the Red Sea like this, then your salvation just might be at risk, because these must be historically true, or the whole Bible is to be thrown out. That has essentially destroyed the very preciousness of the stories they sought to carry on. But those who have entered that ocean they've left behind the factualization, but they continue to know, remember that the story is important. On the liberal side of the tradition, the liberal side has demythologized these stories. They've said, you know what, it's okay not to count every single story in the Bible as having happened exactly this way. However, in the process of demythologizing the stories, they've also ended up largely dismissing them, saying they're no longer basically relevant. They didn't happen this way, they're no longer that relevant. Just a couple of weeks ago, my good friend John Shelby Spong was standing right here dismissing the Passover story as a story of a primitive tribal God for whom it represents a time in our faith history when we believe that, well, God just basically hates everybody that we hate and slayed the Egyptian children because of that. And we need to move beyond that story. That's a dismissal of the story. As much as I love Bishop Spong, and we're great friends, I have a bone to pick with him on that level, because so much of the stories we've just simply said, well, we need to move beyond. But what the gift that we've brought in the liberal end is that sense of it doesn't always have to have happened exactly that way. And when you combine the importance of why is this story important, and yet it didn't happen exactly that way, then what's the value? Why is it continuing to be important? And what people in the Convergence more are discovering is a re-mythologizing of their faith. That is, they're learning that these stories actually may not have been written simply because they happened 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. They represent what happens always and what continues to happen in our lives. So, for instance, the Passover story, God slaying these Egyptian children. We ask, okay, what if it didn't happen for real, so to speak? That's our modern categories, for real. What if it didn't happen historically? Why would they have written this story then? Why would they have bothered? Well, if you take it that way and ask those questions, you begin to discover all kinds of layers of meaning to the story that go way beyond the historical. For instance, could the story be telling us that when you oppress people, and so many of us engage in oppressive behaviors towards groups of people in order to protect ourselves and also to make a better life for our children. We'll happily exploit others as long as we can then make a better life for our children. When you exploit people and oppress them over long periods of time, your own children die. You end up ruining the life of the very children you think you're working for. Or we can apply this to the environmental crisis. If we are going to abuse the earth and just do whatever we want in order that we can have ours and our kids can have theirs, we are not making a better life for our children. We need to be re-mythologizing our faith to see that these old stories speak as if they were written yesterday. If we'll pay attention to them. So that's just one layer of 12 points. I'll just simply list the 12 then. Thirdly, these communities of people are letting go of the notion that people of faith are called to dominate nature. They are embracing a more organic and reverent understanding of human relationships with the earth. Fourth, they're letting go of empty worship conventions and overemphasis on doctrines as tools of division and exclusion. They're embracing more diverse, creative, engaging approaches, often making strong use of the arts. Fifth, they're letting go of a narrow definition of sexual orientation and gender identity. They're embracing with increasing confidence and understanding that affirms the dignity and worth of all people. Bear in mind that every single person who is swimming in this ocean is all on the same page on all of these characteristics. This is just if you were to kind of show the ocean in general, this is what it looks like through my eyes. They're letting go of an understanding that people of faith should be only interest themselves in the spiritual well-being of people, and they're embracing a more holistic understanding that physical and spiritual well-being are related. They are letting go of a desire to impose their particular vision of faith on wider society, and they're embracing a notion that their purpose is to make themselves more faithful adherents of their vision of faith. They're letting go of old rivalries between liberal, moderate, and conservative branches of their faith, and they're embracing a faith that transcends these very definitions. They're letting go of notions of the afterlife that are dominated by judgment of unbelievers, and they're embracing an understanding that as God's creations, God is eternally faithful to us, and that all people are loved more than we can comprehend. They're letting go of a notion that faith and science are incompatible. And they're embracing the notion that faith and science can serve as allies in the pursuit of truth, and that God values our minds as well as our hearts. They're letting go of the notion that one's work and one's spiritual path are unrelated, and they're embracing an understanding that rest and recreation, prayer and reflection are as important as work, and that our work is a calling and an expression of our sweet spot. And finally, they're letting go of the old hierarchies that privilege religious leaders over lay people, and they're embracing an understanding that all people have a mission and a purpose in life in response to the call of the Holy Spirit. It's no longer about who wears the robes, but who lives the life.
Building on this, I think one thing that's been very evident to me in just the living I've been doing and the writing and the thinking and taking care of 2 little grandchildren every day for about 5 hours while my very beautiful and darling daughter-in-law goes to work, and Jeannie and I have this terrific intervention in our schedules to provide care for these little ones. You know, it concentrates the mind, because once the pressure of parenthood is off and you're a grandparent, with these 4 children, you can really enjoy them, and you see this kind of luminous, transparent being before the mask of what we call adulthood, but actually is not adulthood. They're adult because you see who they are. They have no pretense, which is really more grown up than most of us sitting here, perhaps. Certainly me. But it concentrates the mind because you have to try to tell these little children the truth. And then that gets way past posturing of what kind of a Christian am I? Am I a liberal or conservative or whatever? Here you're just grandfather, or as my little Lucy calls me, Ba. And you work to open doors for these little children to what is best and most beautiful in life, and to try to protect them from harm in every way imaginable, including the harm of bad ideas. And you know they're going to confront these things, but you want the father figure in their life, being John, my son, who was the Marine, who's their father, and their secondary father figure, this grandfather here, to be the kind of figure that leaves them with the impression of eternal security. that literally there is nothing they could do to take you out of the light of your love. Certainly, they could not believe wrong ideas about you that would then make you want to condemn them for 5 minutes, let alone eternity. And so the ridiculousness of the fundamentalist approach to faith is very simple for me, and that is, I know that I have been a jerk a great many times in my life. And if a jerk like me in 61 short years can learn to give and receive unconditional love that cannot be changed based on another person's behavior toward you, then surely the God of the universe cannot be created in the image of the worst of what humanity can produce in terms of writing off other people. So I have been kind of trying to think, what do I really believe? And some of the things that come through in a knee-jerk response from me, because it's what my mother told me, have stuck in interesting ways. Lucy, my little granddaughter, and I live on a marsh, and there's big outcroppings of granite. And one day she has seen me do a lot of building because I've been pouring some concrete, and I do carpentry and this kind of thing around my property and her dad's house as well. And so one of her natural questions over the last couple of years has been to see something and say, who built that? So she asked very naturally, who made this rock? And this big outcropping of granite. And I didn't have a theological response about, that would have pleased Bishop Spong or me or my dad or anybody else. I just said very automatically to her, God made it. Well, later, I got into a bit and was talking to her about the fact we're made of stardust and so forth and so on, so I sort of modified it. But the initial response I saw from the heart was what I actually believe, not in a theological sense, but in the sense that when you're talking to a 4-year-old little girl that you love past loving, you tell her what's in your heart, and that response was very natural. In thinking about later stages of Christianity and what it means to me and where I think the convergence principle can have a foundation to stand on for people who come from whatever background it is stripped of the literalism and the judgmentalism, which is really what the 12 points boil down to in essence, a lot of it. It is time in our triumphant country, our imperial nation, built on this idea of American exceptionalism, because we were talking about how the church is changing here, to remember that the only throne our God has ever had on earth, from whatever point of view you look at Christianity, fundamentalist or liberal, allegorical or literal, the only throne that God has ever had on earth was a cross of execution. If you begin at that point, rather than the triumphant attitude from the left or the right of we have the truth, but rather I will be sacrificed instead of sacrificing, then you have a meeting point where I think we could actually build something again out of this mess we've made. And so I would just like to conclude with that. It's nothing new or improved, but just remember in this country of ours that is built on a triumphalism of globe-trotting militarily, celebrating violent responses to people, right to carry laws, stand your ground laws, in-your-face everything laws, a surveillance state that we now live in, always justifying some level of protecting our stuff. That the only throne that the God, both of fundamentalists and liberal Christians, acknowledge on this earth was a cross. So I think if we can begin at that point, then these points really make sense and can live. And I think we have something to pull people to their senses with and say, let's build from that point, rather than from the certainties of liberal theology or the certainties of fundamentalism. Because unless I'm reading everything wrong, and I'm not talking about the Bible, but my life experience, the leader of a movement whose only position of power was to renounce all power is not a leader of a movement who is interested in, A, sending anybody to hell based on judgment, or in a theological construct of any kind, but far more interested in reversing this tradition of sacrifice and victimhood that you see running through all religion and saying, this is where it stops. And now I'm going to show you a new way. So it's the opposite of the kind of view of salvation that we're sinners, and so God had to send his son to be murdered instead of killing us. And rather it's to say by becoming the victim, the whole idea of judging anyone as the other is over, because the only throne Christ had on earth was a cross. So I don't think that that's outside of the possibility of presenting to a fundamentalist or a liberal Christian. And I think if we can get to that and make that the essence of this message, then we might just perhaps over a long period of time be able to build back from this destruction that's been wrought in the name of Christianity.
Amen. Reminds me of the Jesus First Baptist Church when we were staying at the church camp, when I had my own kind of transformative experience in worship. The fundamentalist minister at the end of the worship service, after supporting Crosswalk America and take up an offering for us, said, I handed him my book on the Phoenix Affirmations, and I said, "Sir, I'm sure if you read this, you'll find that we have some things that we disagree on, but I think you'll also find that we have some common ground to share." And he said, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Son, at the base of the cross, it's all level ground."
Mm-hmm.
It's all level ground. Yeah. And it's that level ground in which we have found friendship.
Yeah.
And I think that our story connects with the story of millions, perhaps is connected with your story in some way, shape, or form. What I find particularly hopeful is that if the story does resonate, Christianity has a deeply hopeful future. It is a new Easter point. It is a new, we are entering the ocean together in ways that none of us could really have predicted.
Well, I'd like to just add one other thing, and that is in terms of the kind of apocalyptic problems that are facing this world today, in terms of global warming, population war, and religious war, which just is going to be unending, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. This is the era we're living in. Only this fundamental principle that the sacrificers, the oppressors, become the people who become sacrificed themselves voluntarily. Literally the message of Christianity. And this is where I'm most definitely a Christian. The message of Christianity is that God's throne was a cross on earth. And therefore the presumption of oppressing people or doing things in the name of you being right goes out the window. And really, literally, I think, just in philosophical and spiritual terms, the message of Christianity is perhaps literally the last best hope of humanity, if it's understood in this way. And you cannot really build back from the tremendous leveling we've done to this planet unless you begin to take on the attitude that the person in charge has to be willing to be the last and not the first. And that goes for whole cultures as well as individuals. If that can be preached again, we have a shot of survival. If it isn't, it isn't just a question of what happens to Christianity in America. The days of the human race on this planet as we understand it are going to run out very quickly and exponentially and quickly. So I don't think this message is simply a religious or theoretical message any longer.
Yeah.
I think it's much more than that.
Well, my hope in all this, as a way of closing, would be that, if you would ask me years ago, could we solve the environmental issues? Could we solve the issues between religions? Could we solve our economic issues and so forth? I would say we could sooner solve them than friendships like this happen. And guess what has happened? God is able, when we get our egos out of the way, just enough. Not that they're ever disengaged fully, but just enough to surprise us all.
To surprise people, We looking for some questions, perhaps. There are people with microphones. If you'll just put your hand up, And we'll move along in a timely manner. There, yes, sir. I think somebody's got their hand up right there.
In view of the way you talked tonight about the church, and I'd like to have your opinions on the concept of Unitarianism, and is that a possibility here or anywhere in the world?
Well, I'll just briefly note that I have spoken fairly frequently at UU communities in different parts of the country, and always seem to, I've never been burnt at the stake anywhere. I've never known any Unitarians to burn anyone at the stake, but yeah, I mean, for me personally, this path is a path that can be traveled by people of goodwill across the board. And so when I say the particular message of Christianity is paramount, I don't think that would change if I was talking in a Unitarian community if that question came up, because at the very least, they understand that in terms of the global issues we face, we would agree on the fact that if we're not willing to take a second position to the overriding needs of others, which is what the cross represents, we're done. So even if you took that metaphorically in a very Unitarian manner in terms of Trinitarian theology, it doesn't make a bit of difference. And I would say that for completely non-Christian faiths as well. Atheists and agnostics, who are my friends, and not in the euphemistic argumentative sense of some of my best friends, I mean literally my best friends, would agree that if that principle of taking a second position in favor of the greater good does not start being applied in our culture, we're done. And so to give it a Christian voice, that becomes Christ on the cross. But that's not where that principle only exists. That's all I would say.
Yeah. I think of the words of Jesus when he's asked what's the most important commandment. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. He identifies three great loves: love God, neighbor, and self. That's the one that's frequently overlooked. But if you don't love yourself, then please don't love me like you're loving your neighbor. Right? You need to have all three of those. And I think that we make a mistake whenever we say that, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So I'll love God and I'll love myself but not my neighbor, or I'll love my neighbor and myself but not my God, or what have you. And I think that that Christians, as a Christian, I think that we can share substantial enough common ground to get along and get along well and do a lot of good stuff together with anyone who holds those three great loves together and says, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. They have to be held together.
Right.
Whether it be Unitarian, Buddhist, Hindu, anyone who holds those values together, we have enough common ground to get some really good things done.
Yeah, and I would just say the only thing that I would insist on in looking for that common ground is that they hold that common ground without then a caveat, no but to it, except for you infidels, except for these people who are across the line. I mean, your neighbor is everyone, and I'll go one step further. Christ, I think, makes it very clear that your neighbor is your enemy. I mean, it has to go to that. So when you look at, okay, all the world religions are going to get on in a nice, happy, clappy environment, that's true up to the point where there's recognition that you also must love your enemy. Because those three definitions then have that added weight. So to me, again, Unitarian, atheist, Jewish friends, agnostic, it doesn't matter. They all need to accept that message. If we don't start loving our enemies, we are done. And that's the bottom line. So that's where my inclusion ends. Because if we're dealing with inclusiveness, it has to include the basic teaching that we have to love our enemies. Or it's not inclusion, it's inclusion except for these three people I hate. And if we keep going down that path, we're done. We're done.
I wonder how you would respond to an email I received this morning, which is in response to my columns, which would follow your general line, and I have talked a lot about research and so on. His statement was, this world will be saved only by scientists because they go after truth. And to be a researcher, as you have pointed out at various times, you can't start in with an assumption of where you're going to end up. And you Christians are starting with assumptions from biblical stories and all the rest of it. And, you know, I don't need to say the rest of it. You kind of get the picture. What would you say to this very positive person? We've communicated for a while, but he doesn't trust the Christian to seek truth.
Well, I would say that's an awfully metaphysical stance that he's taken, that science then knows ultimate truth and is connected to that. That is a far more highly metaphysical truth than any of the religions we've been talking about today. So that's quite a faith statement he's making. We just did a whole series, 6 weeks, on faith and science, and one of the things we noted was that, you know, religion and science ask two different questions. They're looking at the same things, but they're looking at it through different lenses. So you could take a pot of water that's boiling on the stove, and you could say, why is that? You know what's happening there, and you could say, well, it's because there's energy being applied to molecules that get increasingly excited, and they go like this, and that's one way to explain that, and that's the scientific way of describing that boiling pot. But you could also describe the boiling pot as, well, Frank wanted some tea. You know, that's not a scientific explanation.
Or Lucy wanted some hot chocolate.
Yeah, it's not a scientific explanation, but it's equally true. They both have different lenses on reality. But I think I don't want to put words in Frank's mouth, but I think what we're seeing, though, in this kind of convergence mode is the idea that faith and science go together in the pursuit of truth, that both actually are looking at it from truth from different angles, but they are informing each other. They can inform each other mutually. Yeah. And so where this bears its way out, for instance, I think very directly, I think a key convergence concept is prayer and actually connection with the Holy Spirit. And actually, but we don't, unlike the older traditions, we don't simply say, you know, so easily, oh, the Holy Spirit told me to turn left at this stop sign or whatever it is. You know, we bring a very healthy postmodern skepticism to our own understanding of how our ability to receive the Spirit. And so we are aware of chemical influences on our bodies. You know, the fact that I just had caffeine here is exciting me inside, you know, and things like this, that we actually bring a healthy skepticism to our own ability to connect with the divine. But that actually makes us more diligent and also more confident, or at least trusting when we get those signals.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, and that is that I think your friend is over-optimistic about human beings. Because I don't care what they're labeled, and for a scientist, that's a pretty big mistake, because whoever this person is or she, should at least know that we're all primates. And primates are vicious sons of bitches. I lived in Namibia, Africa, for a year, and then in South Africa making films, and there was a troop of baboons near where we had our location. And I promise you, it was a humbling experience to realize that we're on this chain of life with these folks. You know, to them, you know, sex is rape, oppression is the norm, and it actually made me very glad for the evolutionary process and made me see a great deal of purpose in it, because consciousness has led to conscience. There is no conscience in a troop of primate baboons, not that I could observe. And so empathy is not there. I mean, you see it between mother and child where there's a biological connection, but it actually made me glad to be a human being for a while. But I would like to remind this scientist that we are still primates, and that our behavior to ourselves and to others and our planet bears that out. And so I kind of look at some of my new atheist friends who blame everything on religion, and I say, well, you know, you really have this wrong, in the same way that it would be stupid of me to blame all the harms that came from communism in terms of Karl Marx and make it all, well, it's his fault. Well, no, the problem was not communism or Christianity. The problem is primate behavior. We are an evolving species, and we may be on some timeline that will get us somewhere at some point where you can trust both scientists and preachers. Right now, scientists and preachers are equally dubious creatures.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question from the internet. Greetings, everybody out there.
Greetings to the folks on the internet, yes. Their question is, shoot, now I lost it because they moved. They moved on me, sorry.
Well, we can grab one more while you're finding it.
Hold
There's
this,
somebody
will you?
with their hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, we have one here.
Go ahead and.
I'm sorry. The question is, no. I would like to hear them speak about how Convergence avoids simply seeking the least common denominator solutions and actually celebrates and includes diversity, or on the other side, simply merges all traditions, glomming on to anything that comes along.
I think maybe they were meant to say the lowest common denominator, or the, I think,
They said at least.
least,
Do what
yeah.
my dad always said. He said, never answer the question that's being asked. Just use the question to say what you wanted to say. He would have made a good politician.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if the least common denominator is the highest common denominator, I would say convergence leads towards the highest common denominator, which is probably the least common. It's what is the best expression of each of these paths. And it's more than just liberalism, conservatism. It's also,
Right.
I would conclude, the best expression of science. It's the best expression of gender studies. It's
Yeah.
the best expression of human sexuality. And trying to learn from the wisdom of those best expressions and leave behind some of the baggage with it. There was a minister at the Wild Goose Festival this last year who was, I was talking to him and we were talking about convergence outside an ice cream stand, and there were like 12 different flavors of ice cream. He says, you know, convergence is kind of like this, that there are all these different flavors, and some of us are going to be drawn to some flavors, but maybe not so much to others. But it is that the diversity is in those different flavors that are there, and actually it would be wrong to just mush them all together, say, here's some ice cream, right? That it's actually in those separateness, in our distinctiveness from each other, that we begin to learn from each other.
I just add 2 points. I think the question brings up, to me, the kind of touchstone for if there's such a thing as convergence or a convergence movement is the reintroduction of a sincere, not gloss, but a sincere humility to the process of spirituality that's been utterly lacking on all sides. So the hubris has to go out of this, or we're doomed. I hate to keep doing the we're doomed thing, but we really will be. Yeah. So I think the factor of humility and replacing certainty with hope, for instance, as a concept, is a big point in convergence. The other thing that this question brings to mind for me, besides the trying to replace the hubris with humility in terms of religion in general, is that I sympathize with the scientists and the other people who ask these, what they feel are hard questions of Christianity, because they have been attacked consistently from the 19th century forward. But I think they are themselves stuck in a sort of a modern movement, a movement of modernity, which really has been already within our culture surpassed in things like the postmodern movement and so on, where they're seeing a clear line of opposition between rational thought and spirituality. I don't think that line ever existed, but I think it was the hubris of a conservative and evangelical form of Christianity in America and Great Britain too, and then before that the Roman Catholic Church, of course, and other branches of religion, that in a sense drove the scientific community, whether it was Galileo back with his confrontation of the Roman Church, forward into a position of seeing themselves in opposition. But I think we're in an era now, and I look at young people. I do quite a bit of speaking in colleges. I was just at Oklahoma University, and before that I was at DePaul, and then a series of small southern schools. I must say the young people that I talk to in many classes, groups like this, but also very much small group, individual class, they have kind of moved on. These fights are not their fights now. And they're really looking for meaning in their life, not just further statements of irony or where the line between liberal and conservative is or how to vote. They're looking for much more basic sense of, does life have meaning? And I would go back and say, you know, the purely secularistic scientific view doesn't have anything much to contribute to these people. Nor does a hubristic in-your-face, you're lost if you don't believe the way I do. So I would just go further, and I would say, you know, if science wants to survive, what I think will be the backlash against all technology that's on the horizon, well-deserved backlash. If the scientific community wants to walk away from that in one piece with any kind of support from the culture they're in, they had better get on the bandwagon of some sort of transcendent meaning and purpose beyond simply their specialty and their field, and see that they too are part of a larger human race, and they've got to acknowledge that they don't have the truth any more than my fundamentalist parents did.
I feel like you just answered my question, because what I was reflecting on and what has been part of my own journey, the notion of compassion and humility that you're speaking about, and what seems to underlie the 12 items that you've put up there and has been part of my own journey, is the whole notion of the meaning. And what I find is and I'll just frankly say it, I've been shopping around a little bit looking for the meaning, is the return to a sense of reflection and mysticism and centering prayer, and call it what you will call it. But even in my work in consulting with leaders, they're looking for the same thing around, how do I go to this place where I can find that which is meaningful for me and maybe start from there. And I really appreciate what you have listed here of these 12 items, because I think that underneath the convergence and underneath the water, when you see a river flow, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening underneath that. And what is underneath is our own deep and profound yearning for how do we find meaning. And so if you could just comment on that, please.
Go ahead.
Can I just thank you? You just solved something for me. You just put together why an experience from my childhood resonates with me so much now that I've forgotten for years. You know, when I was in late high school, senior year of high school, I went on a youth retreat, and we were out at this cabin up in the Cascade Mountains, and my best friend and I went out exploring, and we found this rope swing on this high hill right next to the cabin. There's a ravine that it was swung over, and it was this. But I noticed that the rope was kind of old, and I was a little nervous about swinging on it. But my friend, who was a little more adventuresome than I, said, "Oh, we got to do this." And I go, "Well, you do it." "I'll do it if you'll do it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So he gets on this rope swing, and he swings out over this ravine up. He's above the tops of the trees, and he swings back, and that was breathtaking. That's great. And so I got on the rope, and I was a few pounds heavier than him even back then, and I swung out over, and just as the rope reached the apex of its arc, it snapped. And I tumbled head first through the canopy of the trees, and survived because I fell into a tree that was, I still don't know what kind of tree it was, but it was one of those trees that have multiple trees that emerge from a common trunk. And it slowed me down enough that my head was this far above the ground, my feet were dangling above me, and I had a cut lip, that was it. And for some reason, that image has resonated with me very strongly lately as an image of convergence. And I think it's that tree. Christianity or faith is like the tree of many branches. Some of those branches are really sick right now, but the common base is exactly what you identified. It comes from our yearning for God and our encounter, even when we dare to say it, with God, and that search for that, where you are beyond words, you're beyond theological categories, you're beyond liberal, moderate, conservative, and you're just raw there facing the universe. That's where we need to get, and that's why tracking spirit, tracking the mystical path is so, I think, central to the convergence.
And I think there's a real hunger. You were expressing people in leadership that you talk to. There's an interesting book by Camille Paglia called Glittering Images. For anybody who likes art, it's a great book. And Paglia is a feminist Marxist. She's an atheist. That's her background. She's written many books on the Gnostic Gospels and so forth, had a lot of people. But this book actually is one that would have put her on the stage with us tonight, still being an atheist, but saying that the path toward stripping meaning out of the humanities as they are taught in universities, stripping meaning out of art history as it is taught as an academic subject. This path, she's saying, is an absolute dead end. And she feels it's threatening the entire educational community, the whole direction of our culture, that unless we start focusing again on spiritual meaning and looking for it in some way that resonates with the next generation, that we're handing people literally nothing on which to base their lives. A friend of mine who's an editor at Penguin was telling me, a story about a crusty old lady there who had been, a kind of a legendary editor that he knew, and again, an atheist who was not just an atheist casually, but capital everything, in your face. And she was all excited because she had tickets to go to a terrific production of The Messiah in the Royal Albert Hall, and he said, what's the deal here? This is not you. Why would you be so pleased that you would snag these tickets? And she said, well, oh yes, I am an atheist, but she said, when it comes to music, the composers who believed in God have the best tunes. So the fact is, when I look at Kamel Palia, who, if you know her work, this should stun you, writing a book at the height of this career of hers, essentially calling for the reintroduction of meaning into curricula, spiritual meaning, no less, a center of moral focus, a dimension that gives you something to understand our history by more than just simply interpreting it as an imperialistic manifestation of power or feminism or misogyny or all these tags that have been put on it that so eviscerate the kind of greater beauty of these things. I think it's significant, and I'm hearing little bits of this in the universities I go to, the kids I talk to. One student after another will come up and have not a concern simply on an academic front, but genuinely be looking for the fruits of the Spirit that we're talking about here. And these are kids from all disciplines. Yeah. It's actually, there is a real, genuine hunger for what we're talking about here tonight, if it can be captured.
So maybe it's more than just Christians who need to acknowledge that the rope that took them out high and gave them that great view is actually snapped on them, and they've been turned upside down.
Yep.
But when that snaps and we get turned upside down, what we confront is that deep meaning, that deep well of existence that is there for us.
And maybe the fact you hit your head so hard that
that explains a lot. People tell me that explains a lot. Yeah.
Frank, I appreciated your description of common ground with the only throne that God ever took was on a cross. And in some ways, I think that's a fairly easy sell to have common ground for folks who dispositionally reside either sort of in the theological center or on the theological left. I feel like dispositionally folks on the theological right would view that as compromise, which is not a good thing. And especially as I sort of view the way the evangelical world holds itself, it seems characterized, especially more lately, by drawing lines sharper and more hard and fast as time goes on. And so some of my question for you is, I guess, is there any hope for the folks from the theological right being persuaded by a notion of convergence Christianity?
Well, I think Eric will have something to say to that, but since you're asking me, I'll lead off on this one. I think, yes, indeed, there is hope, because I think it's a generational shift. And so when you look, for instance, at how some of the social issues are playing that are also litmus tests along with the theology in terms of gay rights and other things, there's definitely a generational divide. I was talking to a young woman the other day in Switzerland where I went for my mother's funeral last week. She passed away at age 98 a couple of weeks ago, actually, Holy Saturday on Easter. My mother had a sense of the dramatic. And and she had a lovely obituary at the top of the New York Times on the top of the obit page, which would thrill her because they mentioned her books and they hadn't reviewed them. So she finally made the Times. And being a writer, that was worth dying for. That aside, and I'm not kidding, by the way, Mom would have definitely affirmed that if you have to have mortality, why not get your books mentioned in the Times? So, but I would say, yeah, the generational shift is occurring. When I was out there, I met a lovely young woman who was staying at L'Abri that is still a very conservative ministry. But sitting down and talking to this young evangelical woman who wanted to be an editor, who had just graduated from Gordon College, which is a evangelical school on the East Coast near where I live, you know, I don't know what the consensus here in the group is, but since you're not throwing things, you know, I see more or less we're sort of on the same page. Her discussion with me and where she's from would fit right here. And many of her professors would too. So I think there's a difference between the official hierarchy, which always lags and is defensive, and where the people are, very much like Eric's story. And the younger generation of evangelicals, you know, I mean, I don't mean to be facetious or cruel. Oh, why not? I'll be cruel. But, you know, good luck with the people who draw the ever sharper lines, because they're going to keep tightening that circle, and one morning they will wake up and they will be standing in that circle alone. That's what happens when you keep redefining your position. And it's the story of all the little fundamentalist groups that run off into the sand and disappear, have all through history. So I have a lot of hope because I see the people that I meet in colleges like Oklahoma University, nice young woman who is with a group of honor students that I was having lunch with. She was homeschooled all the way through by a fundamentalist mother. She's gone to college, but she's not there anymore. But she's not an atheist either. She was just sitting here waiting basically for Eric to tell her what to do. I'm being serious. There's a real moment out there. And like all things that happen, you know, at first it's a bit invisible. But I think the generational shift within evangelicalism is massive. It's far bigger. And I'll tell you a little indication of it, and I know we've run out of time here. But for instance, the fact that all these big evangelical heavy hitters are now listening to the groundswell on one issue, which is immigration reform. You have people on the right of the Republican Party now pushing them to do the right thing because they're getting yelled at by people like this young woman I was talking to. Yelled is the wrong word. And they're saying, okay, well, we should move on this. So, yeah, I think there's a great deal of hope, and I think the convergence principles that Eric has laid out are going to happen in some form. They'll be modified by time and events. But I think it is the future, and I think it's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know much to add to that. I think the compromise thing, though, and the throne of being the cross, I mean, I think this is as much a compromise as Jesus was compromising there. It's not much of a compromise. I would sooner die than embody that kind of faith, you know. So not much of a compromise. I also think about Robert Capon, the theologian, Episcopal theologian, who keeps reminding us that as Christians, those of us who call ourselves Christians, we should be seeking the next way to die. We should be seeking every way we possibly can to die, because this is not a religion of death. It's a religion of resurrection. But you can't be resurrected until you die. You can't be resurrected if you're just kind of a little sick. You have to die. You have to acknowledge that rope has been severed. You have to let go and say, we're not just going to be a little liberal and a little conservative. You know, we're actually going to let go into that river and let it take us where it will, not knowing, neither Frank nor I know exactly where that ocean is going to take us in the future. It's start a journey into the sea of the great unknown. It's about resurrection.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I think everybody would join me in saying thank you for all your hard work on preparing this dialogue, too, and working it out beautifully with the poetry.
Can I mention, I'm such a believer in Frank and his works that if you purchase one of his books tonight from him, I'll give you my Asphalt Jesus book for free. So,
they're all out there.
Which is talking about that walk across the country.
He just wants to look like a nicer guy. But wait, I have an even better offer. And here it is. These are all marked down to the Amazon discount, 30% off. So you're getting I'm passing on my discount. And Eric has secret messages in his book.
Thank you.
Thank you all for
Thanks.
coming. They've
I'll be
opened
out
up,
there at the table. If you want to talk more, I'm not running off. I'll be at the book table.
and they've introduced a lot of new ideas. We invite you to continue discussion out there with coffee and cookies, and see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.